the Midtown studios of Bloomberg Television in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
Benjamin Netanyahu is the new Prime Minister of Israel, the first who was born after the State of Israel was founded. He is on a visit to the United States. He has met with the President. He has addressed the Congress. He's met with Senator Dole and Governor Pataki and others here in New York, including people from Wall Street who might want to invest in Israel. This is one of a number of appearances he's made on this broadcast, and I'm pleased to have him at this time. In a number of conversations with me here and in 1994 in Israel, he had said to me that he was going to be Prime Minister. I wasn't sure that that would happen, but I am pleased to have him here on this program now in a new role. First, congratulations and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Charlie. You should have more faith.
Well, I thought that when I talked to you, polls would be even sometimes, then you would be 15 points down as the economy and different issues changed. Let me just raise this question as we begin this conversation. Why do you think you were able to achieve this? I mean, you're the youngest Prime Minister. You did this without a long political career in Israel, but all of a sudden you're where you are now. What was it about you that enabled you to achieve this?
Well, I think you have to divide it into two levels. One is that what are the issues? And the issues drove a campaign. People wanted peace. They thought that the peace wasn't working. They thought we should have more security to make the peace work. That's on the issues level, and I think it was a very important aspect of the campaign. When you ask about my own way of approaching a task or an objective, as opposed to, say, somebody else who would run on the same issues, it is that I usually am less distracted by the surface noise, the daily tempests, the oscillations on the curve. I fix a direction and I try to get there. I once gave the analogy of an experience that I had when I was serving in our special forces, and I was taken all of a sudden to learn how to dive, underwater diving. I was a special forces land. There was a special mission. They told me you have to learn how to dive. They threw me in the middle of the Mediterranean, the cold of winter, and they said, now dive. Now there were enormous winds and enormous gales on the surface as we dropped in. But when you got under the water and you fixed your direction on the compass, everything was very quiet. Storms raging above, but you can go and proceed towards your target with the knowledge that you'll get there despite those surface storms. And in many ways, I feel that this is the way I approach those tasks that I decide to achieve. I focus on them and I direct my attention and my energies primarily to them. I'm not unaware, I'm not oblivious to everything else that's going on. I like to delegate that out and deal with the important things myself.
So when you came here to the United States to see Israel's most important ally and to see some of your supporters who'd helped you through the years and known you through the years, what did you hope to accomplish? What did you set in your mind that you had to do?
Two things. Number one, to reestablish the relationship between Israel and the United States in a new administration, to establish the lines of communications and personal communications between President Clinton and myself. That is one set of objectives, and I think they've been achieved very well, in fact. And the second is to come to this city. I think it's the first time that an Israeli Prime Minister has visited Wall Street, so they tell me. And I talked about investing in Israel. I didn't talk about foreign aid. I didn't talk about freebies. I said, come to invest in Israel because it's good for business, because we're privatizing the economy. We have a brilliant economic future. Be part of it. These are my two objectives, and I think they'll be a continuous objective.
Let me take the President first. You coming here, knowing the President had supported, and the administration at least would have been pleased to see Shimon Peres win. You knew that. You knew of the concern the United States has, and this administration has, about slowing the peace process, about ending the idea of land for peace, about the negotiations with Syria. What did you say to allay those concerns on the part of the American government?
I said that I was elected by the Israeli people to achieve peace. It wasn't to scuttle peace. You know, when you have a very sizable portion of the population of Israel voting for a prime minister, they don't say, we don't want peace. We want our children to live in the threat of war. But quite the contrary. They said, we're giving you a mandate so we can have a real peace. And I intend to produce such a peace. I intend to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, with Arafat. I intend to negotiate with the Syrians, with President Assad. I intend to broaden the circle of peace. I just refuse to have the kind of assumption that says Israel has to make the concessions in advance of the negotiations. I come in with my positions, they'll come in with their positions, we'll negotiate.
But are you saying to the Syrians, this is a new ballgame? We have new conditions for negotiating with you. If you're a state that's harboring terrorists, we don't want to talk about peace until you get rid of your terrorists. That's a new mindset. Let's not talk about the Golan until we talk about terrorism.
First of all, I negotiated with Syria in Madrid, and they were very adamant and extreme in their positions, but we didn't say to them, don't bring your positions to the table. We said, we'll bring our positions, you bring your positions. Secondly, at that time, and now as well, I would bring on the agenda the question of the attacks of Hezbollah that are, at the very least, acquiesced to by Syria, and being diplomatic. It's much more than that. And other terrorist groups that are based in Damascus that are attacking us. I think it's my responsibility and my right, my obligation to my people and to peace, to ask Syria to stop these attacks and to prevent hostilities against Israel as we're talking peace.
But do you say to them, unless you stop the attacks from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, we will not talk to you about the Golan or any other peace issue?
No, I'll talk to them, man. I intend to talk to them with a whole gamut of things, but I can assure you that at the top of my list will be the issue of stopping terrorism. You have to think about it in realistic terms. Suppose you had an adversary, the United States had an adversary that was facilitating or looking askance, looking aside as terrorist attacks were conducted from territory controlled by it against you, facilitated terrorist attacks against your cities, against your soldiers, and you sat down at the table with them, and those attacks were continuing. You would say to that partner, negotiating partner, please stop these attacks so we can proceed to peace. You wouldn't want it to continue all the while that you're negotiating. And that would be my position. But I would talk to them about a whole array of issues, and I'd raise the issue of stopping terrorism as
Is it significantly
number one
different
priority
than the position of former Prime Minister Rabin and former Prime Minister Peres? Is it significantly different?
I think it is, in the sense that I'm not sure that there was this quite as firm a way of saying it or of meaning it, but I mean it and I say it. And I'd rather not engage in comparisons in the past and just say, here's what I'm about. I know that we have differences. I'm prepared to negotiate those differences. I don't ask Hafez Assad to accept my view of a final border settlement between us and Syria. But I do ask him to stop enabling proxy attacks by Hamas against us, by Hezbollah against us.
Suppose he says, fine, I understand you, Mr. Prime Minister. I'll insist that the Hezbollah stop the attacks.
Good.
2, I'll make sure there are no terrorists in Damascus. Now, how much of the Golan are you going to give back to me?
Now you're negotiating. That was best done in closed rooms, and I intend to negotiate in...
But you'd be willing, after those steps, to talk about the Golan?
I'll be willing to discuss my view of how to achieve security opposite Syria. You know, he comes in, President Assad, demanding the entire Golan Heights. I don't see why I shouldn't come in, having been attacked from the Golan Heights by Syria, also demanding the entire Golan Heights, or staying where we are, and let us negotiate.
Arafat, you'll talk to him directly, person to person.
I don't rule it out. I'm not rushing to it, but I'm not dealing here with symbols. I'm dealing here with contents.
But that puts you at odds with the Americans who believe that Arafat was the best interlocutor that there was for the Palestinians. They looked around and said, in the end, we've come to the conclusion that if you want to deal with the Palestinians, you got to deal with Arafat. You want to see the peace process continued. The Americans said, you got to deal with it. Rabin came to that conclusion. Why not Netanyahu come to that conclusion and pick it up?
Whether or not we liked it, we didn't like it. It's a fact that the previous government agreed on Oslo, that they chose Arafat and the PLO as their partners. And these are facts. I've inherited those facts, and I'm going to abide by them. because that's what governments do. Orderly governments keep the agreements achieved by previous governments, provided they're kept by the other side. And that's my whole message here. We both keep the agreements. Arafat keeps the agreements, we keep the agreements. And I must tell you that we've opened up channels to the Palestinian Authority, to Arafat himself. I made 3 phone calls within the hour of receiving the news of my election.
You personally made 3 phone calls?
Well, 2 I made personally, and 1 my political advisor, Professor Gold, made at my request. I called up, I talked on the phone to King Hussein and President Mubarak of Egypt. And Dr. Gold called Abu Mazen, Arafat's deputy. Since then, he's gone to Gaza, met with Arafat, had a kosher lunch, I think.
A kosher lunch?
Well, had lunch. And had the opportunity to convey some messages. And I think these channels will be broadened and expanded and become also formal, not only informal.
You've got a member of your cabinet, General Sharon, who calls him a war criminal. Do you call him a war criminal?
I have many members in my cabinet with a variety of views. We have more hawkish, more dovish. It's a very good cabinet with a very good mix. I prefer to use the language that I prefer to use.
Characterize Arafat then.
Well, I'd rather not engage in personality descriptions. I have, more to the point, a series of expectations. What do I expect from someone that I negotiate with? And that is, first of all, the fulfillment of obligations. But more importantly, I think is the, not more important, but as important is the effecting of a psychological change towards peace in the population. I see it, for example, with King Hussein. You know, there's opposition to the peace in Jordan, but he steadfastly stands in front of fundamentalists in Jordan, and he says, this is the way it's going to be. It's over. And I'd like to see that happen with Arafat as well. And I intend to bring along, and I think this is the advantage of a conservative government making a difficult peace. When we'll make the peace, the next stage, final settlement, or with Syria, and there's always give and take in peace. When we make the peace, I assure you, the entire population, or just about all of it, will be behind us. And I think that's what Arafat has to do.
Arafat has to change the culture in his community about peace.
That's right.
And what's necessary to achieve peace.
Yes, I'd like to see him unambiguously move the Palestinian population towards peace. Not temporarily, not tactically, but fundamentally.
And what's he doing, not doing, that he ought to be doing as we speak?
Well, there are concrete things that we'd like to see. We'd like to see them abide by their commitments in Jerusalem. They promised not to have
not
offices.
To use Orient House as an...
Or any office. They've got 3 Palestinian Authority offices operating in Jerusalem, contrary to their solemn pledges. They've got personnel in Jerusalem, including security personnel, contrary to their pledges. Yep. So I asked them first to fulfill their pledge vis-a-vis Jerusalem. And then there are a whole array of things regarding security, which resulted, the failure to keep them resulted in a policy of closure of the previous government, the Labor government. Mm-hmm. I would like to have a policy of openness.
So what has to happen to have openness and the ending of closure?
A demonstrable policy of security, a permanent approach to fighting Hamas terrorism. This means that you don't release Hamas terrorists from jails in Gaza, which unfortunately they're about to do. I think there are ways to demonstrate that. From my point of view, it'll be reciprocated immediately by an opening of the gate, so to speak, and enabling many thousands of Palestinian workers to come and work in Israeli towns and cities to better their lives. I think this is an obvious exchange of many others.
Rabin and Peres both used to say the peace process has economic dividends. Does it?
It could. I don't think it has had it so far.
The prosperity in Israel hasn't accelerated because of the opening of a relationship with Jordan.
Yes. To a certain degree, yes. I think the main engine actually occurred before that with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, because a lot of our trading partners in the former Eastern Bloc, in Asia and so on, were much influenced by the removal of that Soviet antipathy. But of course the peace, the talks, including Madrid, and Oslo were very helpful in removing some of the stigmas, and it's important for us to have, not so much to trade with the Arab world, but to trade beyond the Arab world.
In every conversation you and I had over the years, maybe 10, 15 conversations on television and in your office in Jerusalem, you would always bring up the covenant with me.
Right.
Are you now satisfied about the covenant?
No, but there's a beginning, and I hope there'll be a completion, that there'll be specific items of the covenant deleted, and a new document, I don't want to call it a covenant, of recognizing Israel's right to exist, adopted. I think that would be important for the next step, for the final settlement. Right now, I would like to complete the existing agreements, Oslo I and Oslo II. I'm prepared to fulfill my part of the bargain, Israel's part of the bargain. I want the Palestinians to fulfill their part of the bargain. It'll create, I think, a good atmosphere of confidence and trust to proceed to the much more difficult issues awaiting us in the final settlement.
You gave a speech in Washington before the Congress that was enthusiastic in terms of the response of members of Congress, ovations, especially when you talked about Jerusalem.
It's great to have ovations in the Knesset, whether you deserve them or not. You're prevented from having them. There's a speaker there with a gavel.
They're not allowed?
You're not allowed, no.
So all of a sudden you're standing there and you say Jerusalem will never be divided. It will always be Israel's capital. And did you therefore, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, mean to say under no circumstances will it ever be the capital of a Palestinian state?
Well, as long as I'm prime minister,
it will not happen. Will never be on the table.
You can place money on that. When I'm prime minister, or for that matter, I would say the overwhelming majority of Israelis across the political spectrum, we're talking really almost every Israeli, believes that Jerusalem should remain an undivided city. It shouldn't be divided into two
But they
governments.
say we don't want to divide Jerusalem. We want it to be. We didn't want no Berlin Wall, as you mentioned in your speech. We want it undivided, but it is our purpose to make it the capital of the coming Palestinian state.
Well, then, here's an area of, one of those areas that I said of immense disagreement. I think it's probably the most complicated area, but this is very different from what I've been talking about, and that is that this is supposed to be left to the end of the negotiations, to a final settlement, deferred, according to the Palestinian side of the version of how it should be. What is happening right now in Jerusalem is that in this phase, in which there was supposed to be no Palestinian activity in Jerusalem, no Palestinian offices, no Palestinian personnel, this was pledged by the Palestinian Authority. They're violating it.
Well, why is that a big deal? I mean, help me understand.
I'll give you
the
an
fact
example.
that they use the Orient House to meetings.
Okay, I'll give you a response. I was just in a delightful city called Washington,
Yes.
the capital of the United States. Now, just imagine that you would have a foreign government building a foreign capital inside Washington. They'd start having their ministries. They're starting to have their own police force.
So
there.
the idea here is that becomes the beginning. That's the acorn that could grow into a tree that would be the
Political
capital.
partition. I'll tell you what I think is the danger here. You're right, there's no Berlin Wall here, but what preceded the physical partition of Berlin was the political partition of Berlin into two entities, and the physical division followed in its wake. When the political division collapsed, the wall collapsed. Now we have an opposite process. After we removed the walls in Jerusalem, in the heart of Jerusalem in 1967, united as a united city, now there's an attempt to politically redivide it into two separate entities, and believe me, the wall will follow very quickly. We don't want that. We want an open city, accessible to all three faiths. They're protected.
And if Arafat, anybody else wants to come worship there, not a problem.
We want to have universal access to Muslims, to Christians, to Jews.
To all of them.
Absolutely.
If they want to worship,
that's what we're doing
total
right
access.
now. Absolutely. The first time that all three faiths could worship in an unhindered fashion in the history of Jerusalem has been under Israeli sovereignty since 1967.
In an interview with Prime Minister Rabin, his revulsion at what had happened at Hebron in 1994, he said to me, "We have to be better." With respect to keeping Israel's commitment to Oslo, Where do you stand on the deployment out of Hebron by the IDF?
Charlie, there are two things that guide my policy here. One is that we keep commitments. The second is that we keep security. Mr. Peres agreed not to withdraw from Hebron, but to redeploy Israeli troops within Hebron to the
protect Israelis
to the area where the Jewish quarter is, which is the oldest, by the way, Jewish quarter on Earth. It's from the time of Abraham, 3,500 years old.
Which probably presents some problems within your coalition for you,
well,
because it has that history.
We feel very deeply about it. How old is the Statue of Liberty? How old is the Capitol? I mean, this is 3,500 years of Jewish history there. So obviously, we feel attached to it. We also want to prevent the massacre of either Arabs or Jews. Both happened in Hebron. The Jewish community was massacred and banished in 1929. We renewed it in 1967. And we had that horrible massacre, as you know, in the Cave of the Patriarchs by this madman Goldstein. So Hebron is perhaps the most sensitive of all issues that we can tackle right now, because it is ideologically and historically of high importance for both the Jewish population and the Arab population. It also has been the focus of major explosions. And Mr. Peres, who had made a commitment to redeploy Israeli troops in Hebron...
And had a plan.
And had a plan, did not carry it out. He just simply passed the, I don't know if to call it the hot potato, but he passed the issue to me.
That was after the election results. He said, I'll just leave that now.
Yes,
to the new prime minister.
He didn't implement the plan on the date that he had said.
So when will you implement the plan that he was going to implement?
Well, I'm looking at the plan, and I'm looking at the questions of security. Now, let's suppose that I just redeploy, something that that the previous government didn't want to do. And there is, we lose control, and very bad things happen. Terrorism, loss of life, perhaps major loss of life. This could not only be tragic for the persons involved, it could scuttle the peace process. So I'm looking at Hebron, I'm trying to find a solution that balances these two principles, keeping your commitments, but maintaining security. I believe there are solutions.
When?
Well, when I sat down to discuss it with my cabinet members, and that's not going to be far off.
One last question about this, and then I want some personal questions. One is settlements. Not just the natural growth within a settlement. You are saying to your citizens, we are going to build new settlements on the West Bank.
When we decide on a pattern, when we decide on the resources, when we decide on the regions, we haven't made those decisions yet.
You haven't made a decision that you're going to do it?
Or how.
Or how. So not even that we're going to do it yet, because you know that that leads to a confrontation with your biggest and best ally.
First of all, we think we have a right to live anywhere, and Jews should have the right to live anywhere, just as they live anywhere here.
Right.
So it's this Judenrein conception of peace is something that I personally
well, it's one
dislike.
It's one thing to live anywhere. It's another thing to go and build new settlements, and you know the history of settlements in terms of the politics.
Well, it's empty land. I mean, when you go. Last time you were in Jerusalem, I didn't really have a chance to take you out there. Also, I didn't have available helicopters. Well, next time you come, we'll overfly the area, and you'll see it's empty. Just most of it is empty. So you can really delineate areas of Palestinian urban centers where they live, and the great majority of the areas
Fair
are
to
empty.
say that President Clinton has less to be concerned about with your policy on settlements than he might have thought before he began to talk to you.
Well, I wouldn't say that. You'd ask him and let him answer that. But I'm telling you that we haven't yet made a decision
to do it
on this. No, we are clearly of the belief that we have a right to be
a right and a plan to do it are very separate things, as you.
We haven't yet sat to discuss this, but I've also shown the president something that astonished, I think, a lot of people in Washington.
The growth of settlements under the previous administration.
50%.
But that's a natural growth, wasn't it?
Well, you don't exactly grow
children
10% a year. It's children, it's marriages.
But they weren't building new settlements, so that was different. In the same way that Eric Sharon built settlements when he was in charge of housing. That's different.
Some things are different, some things are the same. Yes.
You walk in to be prime minister. You've been deputy foreign minister. You've been ambassador to the United Nations. You've been other things. You've been chairman of the Likud party. Do you learn anything new? Is it different being prime minister in terms of what you see?
Absolutely.
What is it?
Responsibility. The most important thing is responsibility. You don't pay attention to the press that much. You don't pay attention to the surface. You try to look at the larger currents of time and circumstance and ask yourself, how do you direct them? With the responsibility of keeping your country and its citizens safe and secure and hopefully also prosperous. So you try to focus, at least I do, on the big things. There are 100 things that are tugging at you all the time, but you try to keep yourself focused on the big things, feeling that sense of responsibility. It's a very heavy feeling.
The big things are what? Security.
Peace and security. Peace and security. And I think liberating the Israeli economy that can open up just a wonderful future for the country.
But with you as Prime Minister, what has changed about the notion of security?
That you don't accept terrorism, escalating terrorism, savage terrorism, as a necessary way of life. The only way I can explain that to you is if you imagine this spate of terrorist savage attacks, Oklahoma City happening, or Dhahran, happening not in Oklahoma City and in Dhahran within a span of 2 years or a year and a half of one another, but every few weeks in New York and in Washington and in San Francisco and in Detroit and in Chicago, and I could go on and on. You say that's unacceptable. There have to be ways to prevent it, and I believe there are ways to prevent such.
You've written books about the subject. So what do you know that the rest of the world doesn't know? And I mean that in the best sense of the word. How do you stop it?
You can't stop terrorism by going after the individual terrorist. You should, and you can try, but that is a necessary but insufficient way of stopping terrorism.
It's necessary for someone like the engineer.
It's a fact that most of this terrorism, you know, when you get somebody, for example, what you had in Dhahran, you know, if somebody puts together a 2-ton truck bomb, that is not, these are not two idle students sitting in a cafe in Mecca. It is usually an organization that usually has the support of a government and the wherewithal of a government. And therefore, instead of just looking at the people who made that particular truck bomb, you ask yourself, where are the people who give them the wherewithal? And we can address that government and those hosts far more easily with political and economic pressures. And that's been absent on the whole. I think we should remember the basics.
And the basics are?
Say to make the sanctioning of terrorism or proxy wars using terrorism costly.
Single terrorists do not exist in a vacuum.
No. Well, they do, but they're ineffective and they're unsuccessful. The kind of terrorism that we're facing, and indeed the kind of terrorism that you're facing, I mean, the United States and the Middle East, is definitely organized terrorism which enjoys the support of sovereign states.
When did you first want to be Prime Minister?
I made the decision after my friend and in many ways my mentor, Moshe Arens, made the decision not to run for the premiership after Mr. Shamir resigned. But was it on my mind as a future potential before? Yes, it was. I didn't grow up with that. I had no political discussions as such, partisan or party discussions when I was growing up. We were, in that sense, a very apolitical house. And into my 20s, I had no political interest whatsoever. In fact, I was courted by several parties after I finished the Army and finished my school, and I said, I don't want to enter politics.
I'm going into business.
I wanted to be self-sufficient. I wanted to be at least possessing a knowledge that I could earn my living and not be dependent on politics to feed my family. But I think things changed when I came here, when I went to Washington and later to the UN. I think that's when I decided to move away from being an appointed representative to being on the side of those making the policy decisions. And once you're in the chute, once you begin to get into the Knesset, then you begin to think about it.
But you leapt over some Meridor, Begin, Sharon.
I wouldn't say leapt over. You know, we're trying to work.
You became the leader. They wanted the job.
Only natural. And there's a period of adjustment. It's the rule of, you know anything about physics?
Well, probably not.
Okay, well, you know it. You just haven't thought about it. You know, if you look at a rotating disc like a record, you know that
For every action, there's an equal and opposite
no,
reaction.
no, it's a different. It's a far simpler thing. You have a crumb of bread on the outer rim of the record, and you have a crumb of bread on the inner rim. The outer rim moves a lot faster. It turns a lot faster because it covers a bigger distance at the same time. And what you have in politics is that same principle. The outer circle, the public, adjusts very quickly
It's
to
the
a
inner
change.
circle.
As you get closer to the inner circle, the problem of adjustment is more difficult. They've been there. They've done things. They're able people. They're talented people. They've given good part of their lives to the state of Israel. They've achieved things. And they have to adjust to somebody else coming in. So it takes a little more time. But we're working in, I think, in very good cooperation. I'm very glad that Dan Meridor, myself, and Jacob Frankel, the head of the
Economic guy.
the head of the governor of our bank,
Right.
central bank, we're working together to effect, I think, an economic reformation of Israel, and it's wonderful.
But you are, just last question, you are enormously influenced by your experience in America.
In many
Not
ways.
just when you were here serving your government, but your education here.
Mm-hmm.
You're said to be the first American-style politician. You're said to want to establish a government that, in a sense, because you're the first direct elected prime minister, there's a national security arm within your office. There's an economic arm within your office. You want to do things differently.
Yes, I do. Very much so. And I like to take the good things that I've seen in America. Not everything that I've seen here is good. Quite a few things that I don't want to see come to Israel. But there's so many positive things in the way that the American economy is managed, in the way that there is accountability in American public life. And I'd like to bring that to Israel. I've brought some of that to Israel.
Finally. There's a look at your assistant who's saying, thank God. Most people want to believe that there's no turning back from peace. This process, whatever its imperfection, you can't turn back. Too much has been gained to turn back. Is that a iron conviction of yours?
In many ways, yes. I think that we have to safeguard and protect what's been achieved, the peace with Egypt. I'd like to see that move forward and not backslide. The peace with Jordan, tremendous achievement with a very courageous leadership there. And the peace, the beginning of peace, that isn't yet complete, with the Palestinians. I want to move that forward. I don't want my children, I don't want their children to live in perpetual enmity. We've gone a process. It's had its imperfections, as you know, to put it mildly. But I've been elected to continue the process and to correct as many of the imperfections as we can. We're getting characterized and caricaturized in many of the discussions as though we don't have that basic impetus towards peace. And that's simply not true. We do, and we must have it. That's what we're here for.
And you believe that, like Nixon to China, Netanyahu may be the right man to make peace with the Arabs?
I could give you a few other examples, but in essence, yes, I think it's generically true of our part of the world that firmness and conviction and strength are probably the best recipe for a deal that will endure.
And secondly, that the best thing a politician can have for him, as Ronald Reagan understood, is to be underestimated by your opponents.
That's a wonderful gift.
Thank you. Pleasure to have you on the broadcast again.
Thank you, Charlie. Pleasure being here.